It's August 5th, time to celebrate Bertha Benz. Woo! And right about now you're going, wait a minute, who's Bertha Benz? Well, I can tell you, she didn't invent the automobile, but she did invent the road trip. Hi there, Rick DeBroy with another chapter in the automotive evolution. Here once again at the Martin Auto Museum, a great collection of more than 170 cars here in Phoenix that span the full automotive spectrum. I mean, we have a Corvette C8, a modern supercar, and then we have this right here. Now that's a replica, but it's a replica of the 1886 Benz Patent Motorwagen, what is officially considered the first production car ever built. We'll talk more about this in just a moment. But first, make sure you like and subscribe down below, and in your comments, let me know what I got right, what I got wrong, and I want to know what your thoughts are about this thing. Is this the way you would have built it? Would you have been brave enough? Would you have been smart enough and forward-thinking enough to consider buying one of these back then? I'd love to hear your thoughts on what it must have been like to drive around in one of these. Now, we're going to talk about Bertha in just a moment, because Bertha Benz is very important in the evolution of this car right here. But before we get there, well, we have to talk about Karl Benz, the inventor. Now, Karl Benz was a German engineer and inventor who forever changed how the world moves. He was born back in 1844 in Mulberg, Germany. By his early 20s, he was designing and building engines. He was always trying to find new ways to make them smaller and more efficient. All right, let's take a moment to imagine the world back in the 1880s. The streets were ruled by horses, of course. If you wanted to get somewhere, well, you hitched up a carriage. But in Germany, Karl Benz had a different vision. He imagined a world where you didn't need an animal to pull you around, where a machine like this thing could do it for you instead. Benz didn't really invent the automobile. Plenty of people had similar ideas back then, but everybody was really doing it differently. In fact, a lot of people were using steam engines. But you know, the problem was they were heavy and they were clunky. They were better suited for trains than for city streets. Benz believed the future was in a lightweight, gasoline-powered vehicle. I'll talk about gasoline in a moment. But what he built didn't look like a car as we know it today. It had 3 wheels, a wooden frame, and a tiny single-cylinder engine that produced less than 1 horsepower. It was barely enough to move this thing, but it ran. It was simple, it was direct, and it was really unlike anything the world had seen before. On January 29, 1886, Karl Benz received a patent for this creation. He called it the Benz Patent Motorwagen. That document, by the way, is considered by many to be the birth of the production automobile. This wasn't a carriage with an engine bolted on. It was designed from the ground up to be something entirely new, a motorized vehicle for personal travel. And not surprisingly, at first people weren't quite sure what to make of it. The motorwagon could manage about 10 miles an hour, which might have felt fast at the time, might have even felt scary or dangerous. Crowds would stare as people would drive by. Some were fascinated, some were skeptical, but the idea had been planted. A future without horses was now possible. Well, let's walk around and take a look at the design of this 1886 motorwagon that was designed by Karl Benz. Once again, this is a replica. And you'll notice it's very different than anything else that would have been on a road or a path back in those days. And Karl Benz couldn't just put an engine on an existing carriage because, quite frankly, the engine wouldn't have had enough power for that. So he had to build something that was small and light. He used bicycle wheels for a couple of reasons. First off, they were small and light. They were easy to get a hold of. Plus, that was his hobby. He loved riding bicycles, and it was pretty new and novel even back then. So the idea of using bicycle wheels made sense. Steering wasn't done with a steering wheel. They weren't using those at that point in time. This is a tiller system. And you notice you simply grab this and you use it to point in the direction you want to go. I get a kick out of the fact they've got a pointer. I think people probably could have figured it out without that. Interestingly, this actually uses a form of rack and pinion steering. As the tiller is moved, that little section goes in and out just like rack and pinion steering. And you can see the way it causes the wheel to turn right or left. You know, nothing fancy, very simple. Chain drive that would power the rear wheels, massive rear wheels, because remember they had those big, huge, massive big wheel bicycles back then. We'll talk more about the engine in a moment. The 4-cycle engine was really invented by a guy whose name was Nicholas Otto, I think in the 1870s. All right, now you're probably thinking, oh, Otto, that's how we get the name automobile. The reality is that's not how it happened. Automobile is actually, well, it's a couple of terms together. Auto meaning self, mobilis meaning movement. Nicholas Otto may have his automobile engine in a lot of cars these days, the four-cycle engine, but the reality is Otto, from O-T-T-O, Nicholas Otto, had nothing to do with the automobile back in its days. This was a horseless carriage, is what many people called it. Once again, you see the name motor wagon right there. There was a big debate in the late 1800s and early 1900s about what to call these. Some people specifically wanted to call them a horseless carriage to pull off and make important the fact that it didn't have a horse. There were all kinds of names, crazy names in fact, that were pushed around. But automobile is the one that stuck. So Karl Benz invents this in 1886. By 1888, well, he's got this wonderful contraption in his garage and a patent on it, the first real production automobile potential. But here's the thing. No one actually cared. You see, people didn't understand why they needed a horseless carriage. After all, they had a perfectly good horse. And Karl, he really wasn't a showman. He was an inventor. He tinkered, he refined. But the world wasn't paying any attention. But this is when his wife, Bertha Benz, decided to take matters into her own hands. After all, she was one of the key investors in the company. One morning, before sunrise, without telling Karl, as the legend goes, she rolls this motor wagon out of the workshop. She grabs her two teenage sons and leaves. Her plan was to drive from Mannheim all the way to her mother's house in Pforzheim, about 66 miles away. No one had ever done anything like that before. The trip wasn't easy. The motor wagon ran on something called Ligroin, basically a cleaning fluid you could only buy at a pharmacy. So Bertha had to make the world's first fuel stop at a little apothecary along the way. When a fuel line clogged, well, she had to unclog it with her hat pin. When the brakes wore thin, she convinced a cobbler to nail some leather on them, which, by the way, pretty much invented brake pads. And by the end of the day, she'd done it. She pulled up in front of her mother's house, tired but triumphant. More importantly, she had proven that the car worked. Bertha's bold trip changed everything. Suddenly, the motor wagon wasn't just a weird contraption sitting in Karl's shop. It was a real way to travel. That one daring road trip basically launched the idea of the automobile as family transportation. Oh, and just for the record, she went back home the next day. And it all began on August 5th, 1888, which is why August 5th is Bertha Benz Day. And right about now, you're probably thinking, Benz, I think I know that name. Of course, that's right. Karl Benz got together with Daimler. They created Daimler-Benz. And of course, that is the foundation for Mercedes-Benz. Well, no hood to lift, but we do have an engine compartment at the back of the car. A single-cylinder engine. Actually, it's pretty large. The piston is 954 cubic centimeters for the engine size. It would spin at about 400 RPM. It only produced somewhere between maybe 2/3, 3/4 of a horsepower. Not a lot. In fact, this had a hard time going up hills in the early going until they figured out how to get the gearing just a little bit better. Really critical part was this massive flywheel right here. And this really accomplished a couple things. First off, this is how you started the car. You would grab it and you would spin it around. Usually it would take a couple tries, but eventually it would get the engine to kick over and it would start. And once that happened, well, this big flywheel would maintain the momentum to keep the engine going. This is the fuel tank. This is a coolant reservoir. This drum right here is how the power gets transferred from the engine to the wheels. This band goes down to a second drum that is right underneath the seat. There's a drive shaft that goes from one side to the other, a chain, and that goes back to the rear wheels. And that's what spins everything around. Now, if you're driving along and you want to slow down, well, that's what this lever is for right here. That is the brake. You pull on that, and that would actually engage another leather band that went around that same drum that would tighten on it and slow it down. Now, you think about the creativity of coming up with this in the mid-1880s. I mean, Karl Benz in his workshop has to figure out how to make the gears. He's got to machine his own piston for that. He's got to come up with a coolant reservoir, this massive flywheel. Now, the bicycle wheels, I'm sure there were plenty of parts he could source, but figuring out how to put it all together was not an easy thing to do. So you got to give a guy credit back in the mid-1880s for what he was able to create and invent that was really the foundation of the automobile production world. Here's a question. Why gasoline? Why did it become the go-to fuel for automobiles? I mean, after all, steam and electric cars were actually available in the beginning era of the automobile. And when Nicholas Otto created that first four-cycle engine, he used something called coal gas or town gas. It's made by heating up coal into a flammable mixture. But gasoline has an interesting story. Turns out that it was actually a byproduct of refining kerosene. Kerosene was a very commonly used oil back in those days. And the gasoline, guess what? They would throw it away or just burn it off because they really had no purpose for it. And once the inventors began to figure out, well, what would be the most effective fuel to put in an internal combustion engine, gasoline rose to the top because it was easy to find, it was inexpensive, and it had just the right thermal qualities. So gasoline won the day. After Karl Benz built his motor wagon in 1886, things didn't slow down. In fact, they sped up. You know, as you might imagine, at first cars were rare because they were noisy, they were awkward, and they were expensive. But engineers across Europe and in fact across the world started building better engines. They added more gears. They figured out how to make these strange contraptions reliable. By the 1890s, new inventors were jumping in. Gottlieb Daimler and William Maybach built faster, lighter cars. In France, well, there were makers like Peugeot and Renault that were getting to work on these things. Before long, early automobiles were popping up all over the dusty roads in Europe and in the United States. In fact, just 22 years after this thing was built, Henry Ford introduced the Model T in America. Simple, affordable, tough enough for any road. Suddenly, the automobile wasn't for the rich or the daring. Each decade since the Benz Motorwagen was introduced has really brought something new and exciting in the automotive world. I mean, just look around us at all these cars. What started as a three-wheeled experiment in a tiny German workshop turned into a worldwide revolution and put the world, and in fact especially America, on wheels.